London, June 30th, 1939. Spartacus Olsen reporting on the situation in Germany from our Allied studios. It is increasingly clear that a new war is coming to Europe, perhaps the world. While Germany continues to teeter on the brink of financial collapse under their war preparations, despite confiscations and expansion, nation after nation is belatedly following suit, or as an article in Time magazine put it a fortnight ago. The only reason that so much of the world's hard-earned wealth is poured down an uneconomic rat hole is that men expect and fear the coming of a second world war. That expectation and fear is the greatest political force in the world today. Horror of the war itself makes mankind recoil towards peace, but the probable nature of the war and the fear of its outcome drive men to prepare for it. Tonight, we look back at a quarter when most of the world remained unready, but Germany looked like it was close to ready for that war, pushed by the desperate need to conquer more resources for such a war and their ideological maxim to wage a racial war against Judaism. While in the Spanish Civil War, the Republican forces have now faced final defeat against the military dictator Francisco Franco's army, Japanese aggression continues in East Asia, and Europe stands paralyzed on the precipice of a much wider conflict. In the second quarter of 1939, it is clearer than ever that Germany is on the brink between economic instability and peak military readiness. The regime has pushed the German economy to its absolute limits, which requires the continuous plunder of Austria and Bohemia-Moravia just to keep the state afloat. However, this relentless militarization means the Wehrmacht is now uniquely positioned to strike. Conversely, the Western powers, Great Britain and France, are suddenly scrambling to catch up. Awakened from the delusion that diplomacy could contain Hitler, the quarter saw them issuing a slew of military guarantees and launching a desperate acceleration of their own rearmament programs. After handing the Nazis both the time and part of the resources for their military buildup, they're finally preparing for a war that Adolf Hitler is already fully equipped to launch. As this reporter and others read the situation, the Allies might at this point be about to face a ferocious enemy that only 9 months ago would have stood little chance of fighting them on even terms. The rapid growth of German military power was on full display to the world as the quarter's events publicly demonstrated Germany's transition towards a full war footing. On April 1st, the launch of the battleship Tirpitz at Wilhelmshaven brazenly showed off German naval ambition. Behind the scenes, the true trajectory was set on April 3rd when Hitler issued the top-secret directive for Case White, Fall Weiss, ordering the military to prepare for a surprise attack on Poland by September 1st. This martial intent was publicly celebrated on April 20th, Hitler's 50th birthday. The event was marked by an extravagant 5-hour military parade through Berlin, showcasing the Wehrmacht's newest weaponry and tanks. Emboldened, Hitler delivered a fiercely aggressive speech to the Reichstag on April 28th, unilaterally renouncing both the 1934 German-Polish Non-Aggression Pact and the 1935 Anglo-German Naval Agreement. Simultaneously, the regime intensified its bureaucratic persecution. On April 30th, the law on tenancy agreements with Jews was enacted, effectively abolishing tenant protections for Jewish citizens and forcing them into segregated housing. This mounting terror prompted desperate flights. On May 13th, the ocean liner St. Louis departed Hamburg carrying hundreds of Jewish refugees seeking asylum in the Americas. Also in May, the SS opened the Ravensbrück concentration camp specifically for women, as more and more female targets of terror are being caught in the Gestapo's dragnets. Diplomatically, Hitler worked to isolate Poland and deter the West. On May 22nd, Germany and Italy formalized their military alliance by signing the Pact of Steel in Berlin. Our sources inside Wilhelmstrasse inform us that the very next day, May 23rd, Hitler summoned his top military commanders to the Chancellery, bluntly informing them that further success cannot be won without the shedding of blood, and that war with Poland was inevitable. To secure Germany's northern and eastern flanks against potential Western intervention, Ribbentrop orchestrated a series of diplomatic agreements. Germany signed a non-aggression treaty with Denmark on May 31st, followed by similar pacts with Latvia and Estonia on June 7th. Thus, according to regime insiders, by the end of June, the diplomatic and military groundwork for the invasion of Poland was complete. And while that noose was set up, the noose around the internal targets for aggression tightened. The legal and social strangulation of the Jewish population reached new extremes, designed to completely erase them from the public sphere and the economy. The enactment of the law on tenancy agreements with Jews on April 30th marked a critical turning point. It stripped Jewish tenants of all legal protections against eviction by Aryan landlords. Furthermore, the law granted municipal authorities the power to forcibly consolidate Jewish families into designated Jew houses, Judenhäuser. This legislation not only facilitates the Aryanization of real estate, but also creates the bureaucratic and spatial prerequisites for future ghettoization and deportation. The desperation to escape this tightening net was absolute, yet the world offered few safe harbors. The tragic voyage of the St. Louis in May underscored the dilemma that refugees from Germany face. Made destitute by the Nazi laws and facing increasing danger to their lives, the over 900 Jewish refugees on the ship initially sought sanctuary in Cuba. But upon their arrival in Havana on May 27th, the Cuban government invalidated their visas, forcing the ship back out to sea. As the St. Louis drifted off the coast of Florida, passengers looked to the United States for salvation, only to find the door firmly shut. A mix of rigid immigration quotas, bureaucratic hurdles, and overwhelming domestic anti-immigrant sentiment paralyzed Washington. U.S. officials thus enforced the Public Charge Clause, demanding impossible financial guarantees for entry, and President Roosevelt refused to intervene. By June 9th, recognizing that America would offer no refuge, absolute panic swept the decks. Fearing a return to German terror and after suicide attempts, suicide watches had to be reinforced along the deck rails. Yet, after weeks of aimless sailing, a reprieve arrived by June 14th when Great Britain, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands finally agreed to grant them asylum. Meanwhile, inside the Reich, the concentration camp system continued to diversify and expand its capacity to absorb community aliens. The opening of Ravensbrück in May established a central facility specifically designed for the internment and exploitation of female prisoners. In the newly annexed Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, the Gestapo and SS continued to arrest political opponents and impose the Nuremberg racial framework upon the local Jewish population, ensuring that the Reich's expanding borders brought immediate abuses of rights and dignity to the conquered territories. In support of the now decided attack on Poland, Goebbels directed a vitriolic propaganda campaign designed to isolate Poland and falsely portray the German minority in Danzig and the Polish corridor as victims of unbearable atrocities. The media relentlessly hammered the message of encirclement, accusing Britain and France of attempting to destroy Germany. Hitler himself used public platforms to orchestrate this psychological warfare. In his Reichstag speech on April 28, he inverted reality to justify his abrogation of international treaties. Addressing the Anglo-German Naval Agreement, he claimed that Britain's guarantee to Poland had removed the basis for naval cooperation. Regarding Poland, he brazenly told the Reichstag that Warsaw had rejected his truly unparalleled magnanimity concerning Danzig. Hitler proclaimed, "I have regretted this incomprehensible attitude of the Polish government. The worst is that now Poland, like Czechoslovakia a year ago, believes, under the pressure of a lying international campaign, that it must call up troops." The extravagant media coverage of Hitler's 50th birthday celebration was explicitly designed to overawe domestic audiences and intimidate foreign observers with endless columns of tanks and aircraft. Through the absolute control of expression, the regime manufactured an alternate reality where German demands were entirely peaceful and just, and the looming war was framed purely as an unavoidable defense necessity against Polish provocation and British warmongering. While bolstering that message, the Nazi press suppressed all evidence of the regime's severe economic difficulties and raw material shortages to protect the image of invincible power broadcast to the nation and the world. In reality, our sources show that the German economy is now practically buckling under the strain of near-total mobilization. Despite the annexation of Austria and Czechia and the economically far less meaningful confiscation of Jewish property, hyper-militarization continues to create desperate bottlenecks through critical lack of raw materials and foreign exchange. We are told that already 6 months ago, Germany's trade balance had slipped back into deficit as manufacturers focus on lucrative domestic arms contracts rather than exports. Nonetheless, the Nazi leadership's eager anticipation for the coming conflict left them projecting an arrogant sense of endowment and superiority. Despite renewed armament efforts and military readiness by the Western democracies, Hitler and co. remained convinced that France and Great Britain are weak and will ultimately back down. Preparing for Hitler's 50th birthday, Joseph Goebbels noted with satisfaction that in London, war was being talked about like you might mention supper, but he dismissed British warnings entirely as mere panic inducers. Regardless, come hell or high water, the leadership is fully committed to expansion. When Hitler briefed his commanders in May declaring his unalterable decision to attack Poland, the military high command, previously hesitant, offered no resistance. Now compliant tools of the Führer's will. Party radicals enthusiastically embraced the shift toward war, believing that Germany's military advantage was at its peak. The intoxicating atmosphere of success has erased any lingering caution, replacing it with a fatalistic drive to launch a war of conquest and annihilation. Among the general public, pride in Germany's resurgence is mixing uneasily with a gnawing fear of war and the physical realities of a strained economy. American correspondent William Shirer noted the creeping shortages, observing in late April that the whole life in Germany is now geared to war, but there are signs of economic cracking. Iron is so short they're tearing down the iron fences of the Reich. Despite this, the cult of the Führer remained remarkably potent. Viktor Klemperer, living under the tightening grip of anti-Jewish laws, noted the boundless deification of Hitler on his 50th birthday and how he had lost hope of Western interference. The Polish business will also be peacefully decided in Germany's favor. And then telling us of the full effect of the increased financial pressure on Jewish Germans. I received a second demand and an advance demand from the tax office amounting to more than 300 Reichsmark. The new tax law places a heavy burden on Jews. I can simply pay out of our reserves once these reserves are finished. But all ifs and thinking about the future are pointless now. In the newly annexed territories, the reactions were intensely polarized. A social democratic report from Austria acknowledged the infectious nature of the regime's foreign policy victories, noting that even former opponents were now carried along by the event and admit that Hitler is, after all, a great and clever statesman. In the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, however, the Czech population endured profound humiliation and fear as the Gestapo immediately initiated arrests and dismantled their national institutions. Meanwhile, in Britain and France, elation that appeasement had avoided war is rapidly fading, if it has not already been completely erased. Public and political sentiment has hardened from anxiety into grim realization that Hitler cannot be trusted, sparking a swing of public support for a desperate, belated rush to rearm and guarantee the borders of Eastern and Central Europe. The second quarter of 1939 represents the point of no return for the Nazi regime and for Europe. By now, Hitler has burned his last diplomatic bridges. He has committed the Reich to a war of plunder and hegemony, convinced the West is too weak to stop him. Hitler's decision to issue the Case-White Directive in April and his blunt admission to his commanders in May that war was inevitable demonstrate that the strategic calculus had shifted from political extortion to outright military conquest. To this reporter, it seems clear that such a shift was always Hitler's plan. Now he can speak of it to others, as the bloodless victories of the previous years have neutralized conservative opposition within the German military and convinced Hitler of his own strategic infallibility. But it goes further than that. Hitler's and Göring's absolute insistence on rearming far beyond Germany's economic capacity has now made expansion by military means a matter of economic survival. The Führer has created a self-fulfilling prophecy where his claim that Germany can only prosper by winning Lebensraum has been artificially made true by sinking unfathomable fortunes into building destructive power. Coupled with the lethargy that gripped the Western democracies until Czechoslovakia fell, the German military has now achieved a temporary, formidable advantage in modern weaponry. Even if France and Great Britain have finally begun mobilizing their superior long-term economic resources, it is hard to see how they can catch up with a rearmament effort that has been underway for 6 years in only 6 months and Hitler's fateful date of September 1st, when he has stated he will go to war. But what about the US and USSR? Well, the former has no appetite for war, and while President Roosevelt continues to protest the developments in Europe, America remains a paper tiger as long as she does not follow suit in rearmament and warm to another commitment of troops in faraway lands. Stalin's USSR is still reeling from the purges of a good portion of its most experienced and competent political and military leadership. While they have been keeping up an aggressive and deadly industrialization program, their arms industry remains dependent on German technological cooperation and is, in any case, not on par with the Wehrmacht. Moreover, if, or should I say when, war comes, we do not know who will fight on what side, and thus we do not know what the balance of power will be, because, as the Time article I quoted at the beginning astutely concludes, if the nations which may be lined up against each other can be guessed, it is possible to make a reasonably accurate estimate of their fighting strength in men, guns, ships, and planes. But such an estimate, though quantitatively correct, may be in total error from the qualitative standpoint. No matter which sides will stand together, one thing seems clear. Few will stand on the side of the Nazi civilian victims, on the side of humanity. That spells a recipe for a tragedy of apocalyptic proportions, because judging by how brutally the Nazis continue escalating the persecution of the Jews and other minorities, and how quickly they are exporting this along their expansion, it looks like this war will not just be a war of armies on the field, but a war against humanity itself. Never forget. Join us in spreading understanding of our past to avoid the tragic mistakes of our ancestors and instead build on their achievements by becoming part of the Time Ghost Army at patreon.com or timeghost.tv. The Time Ghost Army is the only force that keeps us going. And on that note, thank you, good night, and good luck.